A core part of any fighting game is pressuring your opponent. You keep them locked in a losing position and you ensure that they eat your future attacks and get dragged into the corner. It's an exciting week for fighting games having oppressive powerhouses released, and a lot of you might be asking yourselves, why aren't I as scary as the trailers make these characters look? So let's talk about how to actually play like that. The main thing you're actually doing when pressuring an opponent is just removing valid options from the opponent's toolbook, and hopefully lowering it to only attempt to block and completely fail. But right off the bat I want to state that pressure comes in two kinds, real and fake. In real pressure they genuinely have to block correctly or they get hit. It's essentially block strings and mix-ups like I went over in the previous video. But fake pressure is much more airy and is essentially about a mind state that governs how you play in fighting games, and it's much more so the real focus of this video. Fake pressure is making your opponent feel like they don't have options but they actually do. This is when people say things to themselves like, if I jump I'll just get DP'd, and other kinds of self-doubting statements that prevent them from properly evaluating the situation at hand. And this really has a lot to do with using your understanding of all the previous videos' beginner concepts together in order to prevent your opponent from accessing their game plan. Really, this is the core game plan part of learning your character and their archetype, whether you're a zoner, a rushdown character, or a midranger. So how is it you start formulating a game plan? Out there exists a great deal of documentation that is intended to introduce players to being adept at fighting games. One of my favourites is this, the Guilty Gear Fundamentals Guide, a massive mystical document that entails all sorts of strategies and techniques that are necessary to play Guilty Gear. My favourite of these has been and always will be the beginning of rule number 1. Learn anti-airs, they are crucial. There's a lot of Guilty Gear specific info in this paragraph, but it's a bit too much to get into for our purposes. I want to just talk about the last line of this opening segment. In order for a ground-based neutral to be established, you must first get good at anti-airing. Basically, if you allow your opponent to jump around, they're going to jump around. Learning all the cool combos you want doesn't matter if your opponent never comes down to the ground to play the same game as you. You need to start making jumping dangerous and wasteful for your opponent, and this is one of the first steps of understanding pressure, how to actually make an option seem inaccessible. Let's look at a familiar classic scenario to understand the most basic kind of pressure, preventing approach. This is the permanent job of a zoner character, characters that love to be full or mid-screen away from the opponent and just punish them for trying to approach them. So effectively, their pressure is higher the further they are from you. They have more valid, safe options than you do, and you must take risks to approach them at this distance. There are almost always matchup specific answers to zoning, projectile invulnerable moves, air grabs, armor, etc, etc. That's not what we're here to cover. What's important to know is that a zoner's goal is to make it scary to attempt to reach them, and for a more short range character, it should be scary to have them in front of you. How do you make that scary? This is largely where matchup knowledge starts to be a thing, or other weird made up strategies that are really just professionals taking advantage of how fighting games are programmed. Depends on the situation in the game. But let's talk about a complete zero situation first, one where no one has any kind of advantage, to just start looking at how to actually gain an advantage. If a match has just started and it's a mirror match, what options do we both have? So a lot of characters in fighting games normally have 1 or 2 attacks that will hit the opponent where they're standing at round start. There's backdashing, which will provide some safety, there's forward dashing, which is quite risky, and then there's all free jump directions, and you can also block. That's about it. Those tend to be your always available options without any pressure actually happening. Let's put a character who's a pressure monster right in your character's face, Giovanna from Guilty Gear Strive. How is it that she cuts these options off? So in Strive, jumping has 4 frames of startup, plus a few frames before you've actually gotten up in the air. Just after you've left the floor, you'll still be in range of some grounded attacks. Generally, anything around 10 frames seems to catch someone trying to jump. Even if the opponent holds up and back, so that they're just jumping and blocking. In Strive, a jumping block move sends your character flying backwards, which gives the opponent more screen space in their possession and leaves you closer to the corner, where of course any mortar cheat, like backdashing, jumping backwards, will get cut off from you, and you'll just get hit if you jump up or forward, so let's just cut jumping from the list immediately. Anything Giovanna would reasonably do when she's in your face and about to start pressure will win in this scenario. She does have moves that would lose in this scenario, like her arrow, but it makes no sense to do that in the opponent's face, so let's just write off the most unreasonable suggestions. So, we've already cut out the jumps, how about backdashing? Backdashes have invulnerability in Guilty Gear, so you can actually evade opponents' moves with this, but this introduces a new fighting game rule. One that I don't think I've ever seen in the handbook, but a rule that beginners seem to overlook en masse. That being, always look at your opponent, never look at yourself. You know what buttons you press, you know how far away you are from your opponent. If everything you do is deliberate, you can scrub looking at your own character from the equation, and massively reduce the number of things you have to pay attention to. The character with the lowest duration backdash is Milia, and even hers falls just around the reactable number we mentioned in the previous video, 17-ish frames. So if you're focusing on her, you can see this backdash, but you're still in a positive state. Let's assume you chose a fast button, but not her fastest, Giovanna's close slash, which rests at 7 frames, and Milia's backdash through it. Giovanna has command normals and special moves that can follow this dash backwards. She can do her overhead, she can do a jumping attack, her arrow, a dashing fast attack, a dashing low, her crouching dust if you respond fast enough, which is very achievable. As I said, backdashing is within this reactable range of frames for a human, and you can easily continue to keep your advantage, and you've gained screen space by winning this interaction. They're much nearer the corner regardless of whatever option you pick, and yes, Milia could anti-air options like your arrow or your overhead, which would make her top half invulnerable and she would punish you. Or a character like Kai could DP you and win this interaction, but the main thing here is their options are severely limited to prevent your approach, and you don't have to guess or react correctly as hard as they do. Most characters' only valid options after a backdash should only be their invulnerable ones, and due to frame disadvantage from how long the backdash takes, trying a normal attack or a jump just loses for them. So basically you only have to guess reversal or no reversal, where they have to respond to your pentagram of valid options. So really, backdashing may be valid, and with a good read or guess the opponent can win this interaction, but their options become more limited than it hinders your offense, and it's a risk for them to take. Some characters have faster buttons than Giovanna and can also win this face-to-face neutral interaction, but they're different beasts entirely and it's a more complicated issue to discuss. What's important is knowing who your character is faster than and who they're slower than, specifically for this case scenario. But Giovanna is a fast character, she's around the 3rd fastest in the game in fact, so she wins against most of the cast in this scenario. So let's rule mashing buttons out. In yellow, it's mostly correct that Giovanna would win in this distance. So really, you should begin to be able to see how advantaged Giovanna is here. The opponent does have valid options, but they require them to take risks, and that's just starting pressure. Pressure often goes in rounds, and it's what people mean when they say taking your turn in fighting games. After you block enough, or faultless defense in Guilty Gear's case, Giovanna gets pushed back too far to continue pressuring. The opponent should know this as well as you do, but this is where pressure really comes into play. Giovanna's main block string ender is this, 214k. It's -4 on block, so the opponent is advantaged here, but they get pushed back, you're free to move, and of course, like any move, you can Roman cancel this move and give Gio another shot at breaking your guard. For throws, those are overheads. Gio can also frame trap during her block strings to prevent mashing, and even though Gio was negative after ending, she's negative by a very low number, and if you watch the opponent carefully, they're going to be too far for anything they do at this range that's valid to be unreactable. Let's look at Kai as a general all-rounder. If I end a block string and he decides he wants to win back space by air dashing past me, starting his jump takes 4 frames, there's another 4 frames before he can air dash, and in Strive, air dashes start slow and gain momentum later on, so there's roughly 10-ish frames of them hanging in the air. It's wholly possible to respond to this jump and grab them, or if you're less confident you can just jump up and fling an attack out to bounce them back into the corner. It's not a very advantageous situation for them, even with the frame advantage of you ending your block string. Their best bet is to take their turn, as was said before, and to try start an offense on Giovanna, but the spacing is tough enough that mixing Gio up is generally out of the equation, and you can only realistically respond with something reactable and blockable, upon which Gio will likely respond with taking her turn immediately after. Gio's offense inherently creates a situation where even if she fails and is blocked, she's advantaged, and that goes for many if not most fighting game characters. The important thing is continuing to pick correct responses to your opponent and restricting their options to the point where what you have to respond to is minimal. It's like the exceptions thing mentioned in the first video. If I only have to look for whether my opponent DPs or blocks me, I can fully focus on that task, and predicting right becomes much easier than if I just assume that every option is valid, which of course it isn't. Let's take these lessons and look at everyone's favourite fighting game redesign, Testament. Testament is a mid-ranger. They don't get anything from being full screen, but they suck in close range too. Testament instead shines at slightly further than neutral distance, but their pressure is still all about making the opponent fear pressing any buttons or attempting to approach, even though it works a lot differently than Giovanna. Testament has more predictions to make by right being a mid-ranger, but they have some ways to mitigate these predictions and also ways to bait the opponent into falling for their attacks. Testament's projectiles are huge. They cover about 25% of the whole screen space, forward, diagonally, or diagonally downwards. Landing this projectile creates a succubus that links into Testament's other moves, but I'm going to refer to the succubus as bait. Don't think of it as a succubus, it's a fishhook with lots of risk and high reward at the far end. This bait sets up three things. Testament's Crow, the opponent being hit by which puts them in a state where almost anything Testament does becomes safe, so they certainly don't want to be hit by that. Testament's Teleport, there are some nasty uses for this. You can teleport behind an advancing Giovanna, you can ignore a Gold Lewis projectile, you can Roman cancel your teleport to appear safely away from the opponent. This move is unsafe normally though, which is why the most important third option exists. Teleport Feint. Doing this shows the opponent the teleport animation, but Testament stays in place, allowing for a punish combo, repositioning, and most of all a mix up between what Testament will and won't do. This move being used appropriately is key to playing Testament against a half decent player, and it makes Testament's pressure have very similar gambles to Giovanna's. Sure, your approach that extends your pressure could be punished, but it can't be done without a great deal of risk involved, and it limits many of the opponent's valid answers to your situations. Testament shoves opponents into the corner with their huge siphon projectiles, and it threatens grabbing, another block string, a low, a feint, and more from this single succubi lingering on this spot. Understanding and using this effectively and limiting the risk you incur during this is key to winning as Testament, and these same guidelines can be drawn for any other character you play in any other fighting game. Any character's main goal is to achieve the state where the opponent feels most pressured by them, and limiting the opponent's options by playing well makes it easier for you to continue your offense too. That wraps up our first lesson on intermediate play in fighting games. If you learned anything or you just enjoyed the video, please leave a like, and remember to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. If you have any questions or suggestions for future content, just write it in the comments down below, and that will be all for this video. I hope you all enjoy the influx of fighting game content lately, and remember to stay safe.